It is Friday, June 26th. Let's talk PlayStation. So as of filming this right now, at least, the July PlayStation Plus games have not been announced. But as our June reminder, you don't have a whole lot of time left. That's Star Wars Battlefront 2 and Call of Duty World War II, so if you have not yet, you might want to download these games or add them to your library. To start off, if you remember last week, we were talking about the Crash Bandicoot 4 leaks. Well, it's now official. We have a trailer. We have a release date, October 2nd. Looks pretty cool, to be honest. So crazy to see that we do have a mainline Crash Bandicoot coming this year, which was a pleasant surprise. And it appears as though Sony does have marketing rights for this game, which, in all honesty, this is a game that Sony really should try and get in bed with because the association is so close there already. But just inherently, Sony doesn't really ever have a problem being the #1 sold platform for third-party games. But either way, it just makes a lot of sense for this particular game, right? Moving on to our next news story, we weren't able to cover this in time on LTPS last week, but Cyberpunk 2077 will be a free upgrade on PlayStation 5, and they've also laid out the timeline here of how this is really going to work out, because obviously this game was delayed from September to November, which is actually good news for a lot of people because they thought, oh great, this is right next to PS5 and Series X, we'll just get our next-gen versions immediately for this game. A lot of people have been theorizing in their head, I don't want to play this game on PS4 because it's so close to PlayStation 5 already, right? So you're going to get a next-gen version, but that's partly true. What they're pretty much promising is a optimized version on day one for PS5 and Series X. What that looks like in all likelihood is a frame rate and resolution bump, and they're promising a more robust update, the real next-gen version that you're probably expecting. That's coming in 2021. That's where you're going to see them really leverage the hardware, where you get ray trace reflections wherever they can really reasonably put that, a texture bump, texture resolution bump, ambient occlusion. Again, lots of stuff that can really utilize extra features of the hardware, and the game's pretty demanding as is, so I'm not sure how much more they can reasonably do. It's a very large game, very beautiful looking game just on PS4 and Xbox One, but you will see a more robust update in 2021, and yes, it will be free on PlayStation 5. That's great. Obviously, it seems publishers do have the okay now to really disclose their options on PlayStation, and that's why we have another game that was confirmed this week is Marvel's Avengers. So this game will also be a free upgrade from PS4 to PlayStation 5. When you get the PlayStation 5 version, you are getting 60 frames per second, dynamic 4K resolution as an option, or you can choose an option that really prioritizes visuals, and same deal here. Ray trace reflections, ambient occlusion, anisotropic filtering, a bunch of texture resolution bumps, things like that. You're going to see the game look pretty good looking on PlayStation 5, so that's also great to hear. But at this point, we're going to get a rolling basis of all these games being confirmed as a free upgrade from PS4 to PS5, whereas Microsoft, of course, is really curating it with a list and things like that. We touched on that last week, but we'll cover every game as it gets announced here on Let's Talk PlayStation. For our next news story, if you were holding out for a sequel to The Order 1886, the 2015 Ready at Dawn PlayStation 4 exclusive, that is probably not going to be happening, at least not from Ready at Dawn. They've been acquired by Facebook to join Oculus Game Studios, so they are officially off the table. Not that they were ever really on the table. Clearly, there's no longer a meaningful working relationship between Sony and Ready at Dawn. And if you remember, they do have a pretty lengthy history there where they did a lot of PSP exclusives, a lot of PSP content. Then they had a huge visual and scope jump with The Order 1886. I think it was really a case of them biting off more than they can chew, but also just having a misguided direction as to how the game was going to be and how it should have played. It did have a lot of jarring choices and issues when it came out in 2015. And, The Order is a game where it ended on a cliffhanger. It was open. Ready at Dawn has said that they wanted to explore that universe, but clearly they're not going to be doing that anymore. And this actually works out for them anyway. They've been doing a lot of VR content since 2017, putting out a bunch of titles for Oculus. So this gives them security, gives content to Oculus. I think that's really a good partnership there. That makes sense. And so that will be the case, and the closure on Ready at Dawn. Now on to our Naughty Dog news stories, to which we do have a good amount to go over this past week. But before we get to the Last of Us stuff, we do have to cover this one. This past week on Twitter, a lot of people in the industry being very open and candid about their experiences at certain employers or with certain people, right? These are allegations, whether it's assault, terrible leadership, favoritism, just all around pointing out all these awful experiences that have happened to these people and their colleagues, and it's just creating this conversation that is very important and needs to happen. And this one comes from Mitch Dyer, who was previously an editor at IGN years ago, and this dates all the way back to the Naughty Dog story that you might remember, where it was a claim that Naughty Dog was forcing out Amy Hennig, and basically that Neil Druckmann, Bruce Straley were trying to take over. It was a hostile takeover. Well, during this week, Mitch put out some tweets claiming, when I reported on Amy leaving Naughty Dog, Steve Butts and Tal Blevins, those are his former bosses, forced gossip into the story. They heard it was a hostile takeover. We didn't want to publish it. I tried to take my name off the story. They would not allow me to do so. They forced an unproven claim onto IGN.com with my name on it against my will to protect their relationship with Sony. When Sony justifiably condemned our story, Steve and Tal were silent. They never went to bat for me for a second. Now, Neil Druckmann and Bruce responded, Neil even being very open, saying, I was really mad about this at the time, but, thank you for opening up about this. Sorry to hear about what happened. Same with Bruce. This is something where it happens. This definitely happens. And, I will always be one of the first people to try and dispel the obvious conspiracy theories surrounding places like IGN, GameSpot, Polygon, your traditional games media, where there is so many ridiculous claims about how these sites operate, which at the end of the day, they are people just like independent content creators, which it seems like more often than not, more people heavily favor them nowadays than your traditional game sites that have a full staff, these people are employed by traditional company, and there's leadership roles that curate the content. And that's what's more unfortunate, that this is still a reality for traditional game sites, which it even happens on YouTube. It doesn't matter, what really circumstance we're looking at here. Everybody is chasing the click, everybody's chasing the dollar, and you do that at many times by running with a sensational news story, a headline, a clickbaity thumbnail and title. Everybody does it, and it's more disappointing for a place like IGN where this comes out, right? And it's like, okay, there's leadership roles in place here that should be curating this content and saying, hey, don't publish these stories unless you have at least 2 sources. Get the facts straight. If you don't feel confident in the story, don't run with it. Instead, the leadership is pushing stuff like this. And nowadays, from what I've read, it seems like they're doing a lot better when it comes to how IGN, at least specifically, has been running. But it only furthers that disconnect even more to where people just want nothing to do with these major sites like IGN. Now, on to Last of Us Part II, which before we really get into this, let's cover the sales of the game, to which it's doing very well. I think no matter what this game was going to walk into, and it did have a pretty tough news cycle for such a high caliber game, it was going to sell well, right? It's not surprising. And this is, of course, an indication of that. Number 1 on the UK sales chart. It's Sony's fastest selling PlayStation 4 exclusive over there, just edging out Uncharted 4 barely by 1%, but it does make it number 1. And if you compare it to the 2013 original Last of Us release, it's up 76% from there. So, of course, Naughty Dog and Sony are very pleased with how this game did, despite the, of course, intense backlash from fans and people going through and playing the game, which segues us nicely to our next news story, is the Metacritic scores, sitting at like 4.4 or 4.5 out of 82,000 reviews, or 88,000 reviews, user reviews, mind you, which is a lot. And this has also prompted things like an online petition on change.org, where that's up to, as of filming this, I think a little under 30,000 votes, but people also want the game's story to be changed, more or less. And so this really dives us into the whole conversation in general, what happened with this game and its story and how people are taking it. It really is fascinating. So I finished the game on a Sunday night, or I guess Monday morning, because I stay up so late. You all know that from the clock when I record videos or when I'm playing games. I'm a night owl. And my playthrough is very meticulous, very slow. I take my time with games, so I know my playthrough is like 35 hours probably, around there. And I'm seeing people finish it in 25 hours or less, so I took my time with it. And I had a genuine playthrough, and I didn't look at leaks. I didn't read reviews. I looked at review scores, although the embargo stipulated that you can't talk about the second half of the game. And I didn't watch the last story trailer for the game, which, by the way, I will not put any spoilers in this discussion. I will speak in the context that if you finish the game, you know what I'm talking about, but otherwise, you can watch this without finishing the game or playing the game yourself just yet. With that out of the way, though, I finished the game, and my gut reaction was that I enjoyed it. I had a great time with it, to be honest. That's my take. I'm not going to try and be neutral on this. You will get my side. I liked the game a lot. I thought it was fantastic. But at the same time, right when I finished it, I knew right away the news cycle of this game, and I certainly saw the initial backlash, which my gut reaction is that I was just enamored with what people didn't like about this game. So after taking my hour breather from the credits rolling, I immediately, for hours on end, watched, read different sites, different videos. I poured through. I don't need my opinion validated. That's the thing. If you like the game, if you enjoyed it, you can find some healthy conversations online about what people did like about the game. I don't need that opinion validated, which you could easily do. I wanted to have some dissenting opinions to try and challenge my take on the game, because clearly a lot of people did not like this game. And, this is something where I'm not going to sit here and try to convince people that didn't like the game to like the game. It's not going to happen. Clearly, there's a lot of conflicting ideas at play here to what people liked and didn't like about the game. And to be honest, a lot of what I'm seeing is just at complete odds with each other. The very reasons why people dislike the game are the reasons why people enjoyed the game. And I think it's also important to note that for people that enjoyed the game, you don't necessarily enjoy what you saw or what played out. It's supposed to be a pretty uncomfortable game for a lot of sections, for a lot of scenes that you watch. So it really is a matter of, and yes, we're playing into the whole engaging thing or the bold choice of the game, but that's what it was. And so if you liked the game and enjoyed that path, you don't necessarily you weren't happy with what you saw, but you just were engaged with that experience. And so that's personally how I took it. And I know that's immediately going to draft up some dislikes. This will probably be the most disliked LTPS we've had in a while, but that's just my take on the game. I can't really change that. And from all the reading that I've done, I can see where people are coming from. I like my opinion being challenged. And even though I'm still not agreeing with what's being said, I can look at those angles and I can see the critiques that are being said, and I can totally see from a lot of different viewpoints what people are trying to get across here. And that, of course, comes with the obvious separation of groups here, where there is a subset of people that have a problem with the diversity representation in the game, and that's, of course, awful. Throw those people away. Not what we're talking about here. The vast majority of people, it really is a situation of they don't like the story direction, they don't like the writing, they don't like the order of the story, or actual mechanics referring to gameplay and things like that. There are genuine critiques going around, and there's no disputing the fact that there is a lot of them for this very particular, very beloved franchise. And so I would hope down the road with what is a very divisive game, The Last of Us Part II, the general conversation improves to where from both spectrums you get reasonable conversations, and you don't have to trudge through so much nonsense from really both sides, right? Because really both sides are being pretty intolerant towards one another. But this is a very emotionally charged game, which we can also acknowledge very quickly the general build-up to the game, which is a big part of the backlash so far, which is the misleading trailers, the review embargo, what was said about the game from Neil Druckmann. And this is something where I don't want to try and defend all these approaches. The misleading trailers is pretty bad. This is something where absolutely the trailers were conveying a totally different direction of the game, and I don't even really think they had to do something like that. This is Naughty Dog, this is Last of Us Part II. I think they could have made a pretty accurate representation of what the game was going to be in a trailer, and this game still would have done just fine, and they still could have had the midpoint reveal as they want it to, which kind of goes in the embargo thing. People are really upset about this, but this is, I guess it's surprising to people, but if you didn't know, this is pretty commonplace with review embargoes, which is that if a game, for whatever reason, and for this one I can see why they did it, you don't want certain things to get out about it. You want players to have a genuine experience and a genuine reaction. I mean, obviously Naughty Dog was really bummed out when the leaks came out, but this is commonplace with reviews. If there's like a key point in the story that they want to hide or they want people to experience for themselves, they're going to put a stipulation in the review, don't talk about this. But of course, it goes without saying that the review scores still can reflect the overall approach of how people felt about the game. So I don't want to have to be that guy to come out here and defend this, but that is something where it really happens more often than you think. And that, for the most part, goes into the same thing about how the game was discussed prior to it coming out, which is, more often than not, I've always cautioned on this channel, when a developer says something, don't take their word for it, because they want to do it on their terms. I've said that so many times here, whether it's the reveal of a game, the announcement of a game, a key detail about the game, story details, hardware. You're not going to just be able to ask somebody, hey, what's going to happen in this game? They're going to tell you the answer. It's just not going to happen. Oftentimes, they will straight up lie to release the product on their own terms or announce the product on their own terms. That's another thing where it just happens. I'm not saying you have to like it or enjoy it, but that's like what happens really. So that's another thing that it's not to defend it, but just to explain it. Now, to round out the whole conversation of The Last of Us Part II, some other minor things that we can discuss here is that during the Kind of Funny spoiler cast with Greg Miller, Ashley Johnston, Troy Baker, and Neil Druckmann, one detail that came out was no DLC planned for the game. So even though I just mentioned don't listen to what every developer says, but this is something where I think I don't think we are going to get more of this game in terms of DLC. That's not going into a whole conversation about a potential sequel, but in terms of single-player DLC, probably not going to happen. He also didn't talk about factions at all, so that might be either further out or maybe the plans for that have changed entirely, but of course he's not going to talk about it. Another small detail, but I found this hilarious. I laughed out loud when I heard this. Greg asked him about PlayStation Vita, you know, was it easy to license a PlayStation Vita in the game? And his response was, that was more difficult than you think, or that was harder than you think. I laughed out loud right when I heard that. Why is that difficult to do? What? This is Sony Interactive Entertainment. It was that difficult to put a PS Vita in the game? Really? There's also a bunch of fat PlayStation 3s in the game as well, which I took a screenshot every single time I ran into one. I loved that. Anyway, on to our next news story. Sony has recently announced the PlayStation Network Bug Bounty Program. This is white hat hacking, where if you have the ability to discover security flaws and vulnerabilities in PlayStation Network, Sony will pay you up to $50,000 for discovering those exploits. So they're opening this up to the public, basically. A lot of companies do this through private firms, but they also do open this up to the public, and they do have payable rewards, where if you find something, they'll pay you. And I think this is actually a pretty good approach, considering that, well, it bodes well that Sony's being proactive and trying to, you know, squash these things because of their history, of course, in this area. But, you know, it is something where you actually open up your reach a lot more by letting anybody do this, considering that just anybody has the potential to do it. Putting a price on it, often actually just straight up hiring these people to join the network team, the security team. It's a very viable option, so I'm glad that Sony's pursuing it. Next up, Xbox head Phil Spencer was speaking with GameLab Live, talking about his reaction to the PlayStation 5 reveal event. He had some pretty interesting words that I'm going to share with you all. He said, and I quote, "I thought they do what they do very well, and they did that. But when I think about the position that we're in with the games that we're going to be able to show and how they're going to show up and the hardware advantage that we have, I think we're in a very good position." So this is Phil Spencer, of course, doubling down on his box. Why wouldn't he, of course, but also playing into the one advantage that they do really have here, which is the hardware advantage. And if anything, I'd like to dial back to what video did we do recently? It was what people are missing about PlayStation 5. If you remember in that conversation, we were going over frame rate, resolution, and how more often than not, for years I've been saying this and warning you, developers will often push graphical fidelity to the absolute limit before they bump up something like frame rate. They often prioritize visuals before they do something like frame rate. It's just much more marketable. And this will still be the case going forward with PS5 and Series X. There's really nothing that's changed here. That's why we're seeing 30 FPS games on PlayStation 5 and even Series X. It's often silly to see people go back and forth about, you know, the 30 FPS games at both events, but it's just the simple reality. Both events had it. You weirdos, come on, get over it. And this is something where, once again, I will preface and warn, we are going to have games that run at higher frame rates or resolution on Series X. It's going to happen, and certainly it sounds as though Phil already knows a few titles in the lineup that are going to present that on Series X over PlayStation 5. Now, it may not be that many titles. It is a smaller gap than what we've seen in previous generations. Some people seem to act as though there's a wide gap here. There really isn't, but it is wide enough where, what do we always talk about when a third party is working on multiple platforms, right? They can't really go crazy with speccing out to one particular platform over the other. This is why we say Sony first party will shine on PlayStation 5, and third parties are still going to look great everywhere, but they have to account for all these different configurations, these different consoles with different configurations, and so there's just going to be a lot of varying performances that we're going to see across the board here. But when you have a machine that has a little bit more power to give, where does it go? It will go to something like frame rate or resolution. And so for Series X, that will be an advantage that they will have, and we will see those comparisons slowly come out when Digital Foundry starts running some of those videos. I mean, you'll see it. It's just a matter of how often will it crop up? Will it really be meaningful? Will it matter to people? And, you know, I've often said, based on what we're seeing right now, Sony's probably still got it in the bag for right now, but, you know, that is something that we got to look at. Someone else that we're also very familiar with, speaking for GameLab Live, was Shawn, the former head of Sony Worldwide Studios, and he was actually diving into the specifics of the unsustainability of AAA games, the length that some games are getting, the ballooning budgets of these titles. And so a number of interesting quotes here. He says, "It's hard for every adventure game to shoot for the 50 to 60 hour gameplay milestone, because that's going to be so much more expensive to achieve. And in the end, you may close some interesting creators and their stories out of the market if that's the kind of threshold that they have to meet. We have to reevaluate that." He goes on to say, "For game prices, it's been $59.99 since I started in this business, but the cost of games has gone up 10 times. If you don't have elasticity on that price point, but you have huge volatility on the cost line, the model becomes more difficult. I think this generation is going to see those two imperatives collide. Then he says, instead of spending 5 years making an 80-hour game, what does 3 years and a 15-hour game look like? What would the cost be around that? Is that a full-throttled experience? Personally, as an older gamer, I would welcome the return to the 12 to 15-hour AAA game. This is some great insight from somebody like Shawn Layden. You know, this is exactly what he did. He managed worldwide studios. He oversaw all these developers, all these projects. He saw the budgets. And the games that he was managing before he left Sony was things like Spider-Man, Days Gone, God of War, Last of Us Part II. Even with Last of Us Part II, like recently playing it, I could not believe how long that game was going, and the fact that they were maintaining such a high visual quality and presentation and scope. I mean, it's still a linear game. Like, yeah, levels really open up, but it's still linear at heart, and that speaks more to it that levels were opening up for a lot of sections in Last of Us Part II. I could not believe it. And this really dials back to the 7th generation of consoles, where we really saw this problem start to proliferate, right? This dissonance between AAA and A, you know, these smaller scale developers that were finally able to publish on consoles through platforms like PlayStation Network and Xbox Live. They're small games, small overhead, they can flourish. AAA had a lot of demand, of course, leaving the 6th gen with PS2, GameCube, and Xbox. It was a huge graphics jump, so people were demanding these beautiful-looking games. And you saw this middle tier, AA, really fall out. A lot of developers and publishers just could not keep up anymore. Certain genres weren't very favorable anymore, like platformers, licensed games. Certain IP just weren't holding up anymore. They just didn't have the budget or the scope to compete anymore. And this is still a problem that we really deal with going into, you know, even PlayStation 5 and Series X. I mean, we're seeing some of these games return, and a lot of that just plays to the fact that how well development tools have expanded over time to make some of this stuff possible for what would be a smaller scale development team. But either way, absolutely right. And I'm getting older too, where I have less and less time, and I still appreciate being able to finish a game within 1 day or within 2 days, really. So, I mean, that's why I was like, oh my god, I'm on day 3 and I still haven't finished Last of Us Part 2. It still keeps going. But it's a fascinating conversation from Shawn Layden to hear that. Now, there's probably a lot more that could be said here, but we got to move on to our next news story, and that is our only PlayStation 5 news story, actually. Been a pretty quiet week for PS5 news, except this picture that leaked out, which shows a PlayStation 5 console on the production line, somebody holding it. This picture showed up on Discord, reposted to Reset Era. Allegedly, it's real. A verified software engineer on Reset Era confirmed, look, it's real. Not much else to it. And, you know, it's not a really revealing picture outside of the fact that it's a very tall console. It's very large. We can't really get a good sense of depth or anything like that. You really can't even see the curvature of it because it very much has some distinctive curves on the hardware when you look at the product shots of the console. But it's nice to see a real-life picture. Initially, some people thought it was fake, and if you run it through some photo software, it comes up that it could be fake, but allegedly it's real. Either way, though, I mean, it's a good benchmark for how large the thing looks, and yeah, I mean, if we haven't said it already, this is going to be a very big PlayStation console. We do have to keep in mind that Mark Cerny did promise a teardown video at some point on this hardware, so to actually see more of it in person, it would come on Sony's terms before they provide the box to any other publication or anything like that, so we do have to still wait on that one. Also, we have to remember that next month is Ghost of Tsushima as well, so we still have one more major PlayStation 4 exclusive to go. That game is still coming out in July, and it has gone gold, so Sucker Punch is locked in. The game is finished, being printed on disc right now, so that's good to hear. This totally confirms that the game is going to hit its release date. And if you didn't enjoy Last of Us Part 2, maybe this one will be more your style. Although I still have some reservations in terms of how this game might turn out. Cautiously optimistic, of course, but it's still nice to see that Sucker Punch is ready to finish this game. Now, let's move on to Let's Talk Plus, the weekly Let's Talk PlayStation giveaway where one of you could win a $10 PlayStation Network code. I would like to congratulate this viewer right here. I'll be contacting you very soon via email or Twitter if you would like to win a $10 PSN code. It's very simple. We do this every single week on Let's Talk PlayStation. Follow the link down below. Supporting this channel a number of ways can gain you an entry, and I will announce the winner next week because I'm trying to pay for your games. Those are all the news stories that I want to talk about with you all. Our Tuesday video was all the confirmed and announced PlayStation 5 games so far, to which there are 79 from when that was filmed. Of course, it's dated immediately, so there's more games, and apologies that the Cyberpunk release date was wrong in there. It's the old date, not the new one. But still a good compilation of all the trailers and things like that that we have so far. And still a lot more topics to cover for next gen, of course. I got 3 or 4 concurrent projects I'm working on. I'm not sure which one will be ready by Tuesday, but as always, something will be there. If there's major PlayStation 5 news, we will cover it right away instead of waiting for Friday on Let's Talk PlayStation. So as always, stay tuned for whatever comes up and whatever happens in the games industry, but other than that, that's it. That concludes this week's episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. I'm Ryan Bandicoot. Thank you all so much for talking with me, and I will see you all next Friday.